Yes, good morning and welcome to Motu Research Round Table. This is the third in a series of webinars where we aim to facilitate those crucial conversations around policy potential and economic solutions. It's becoming clear to us all that we're going to need some real innovation in this space as we head into a very uncertain future. Today we're very lucky to have a global economist, one of the world's leading economists, Rebecca Henderson. She's also a professor at the Harvard Business School. She's going to be presenting to us her book, which is Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. We'll be joined today in-house by our panel of experts, diverse experts. We have Kirk Hope, who is the CEO of Business New Zealand. We have Joanne, who is the Chief Economist at the Ministry of Transport. And we have Phil Tate, who is a regenerist and futurist. So welcome to you all today. You're welcome to also add your questions into the chat if anything springs to mind. And we can put those questions to either Rebecca or our panel as we go forward. So thank you very much all for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll hand it on to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you for your kind introduction. Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. What a grandiose title. The book of a course I've been teaching at the Harvard Business School for the last 10 years called Reimagining Capitalism, Business Big Problems. And it explores whether and how business might be able to solve some of the enormous public goods problems of our time. There are, of course, many, but the two I find it most useful to focus on are environmental degradation, particularly climate change as a case in point, and inequality. Inequality is not accelerating everywhere, but in many of the developed nations and in China and in many parts of South America, inequality continues to increase, causing significant social damage and massive institutional unrest. So, why should business think about solving these kinds of goods problems? They are, after all, pubs. And the classic solution to these kinds of problems is government, or more formally, government in partnership with civil society. We have a great deal of research, and indeed this is a standard prescription in some forms of development economics, to suggest that economic growth and social well-being are maximized when society is on three foundations: a strong free market, a democratically accountable, transparent, capable government, and a strong civil society. And that when these three institutions are in balance with each other, that you can see really quite high rates of economic growth and high rates of social well-being. So if that's the answer, why business? Indeed, many of the people I meet think business is the problem. When I was trying to sell this book, I was in the office of one of New York's largest publishers, and one of their leading editors said, "Rebecca, business saves the world. Do you read the papers?" So why do I think business might have an important role to play as we try and reclaim a just and sustainable world order? So first, it's not clear to me that it's a good idea to sit around and wait for government to fix the problems. Clearly, we need massive political and social movement to rebuild both national institutions where that's necessary, to support countries that don't yet have their institutions in line, and to begin to build the kind of global institutions we need if ultimately we are to solve problems like climate change and inequality. But at the moment, the signs are not very strong that we're seeing this kind of movement. There are some indications, but particularly in countries like Hungary or Poland or Brazil or the US, there's not much sign of governments moving in this direction. So that's one reason to look at this. Second, because I have a very strong economic case for business to act against these large problems. This is most easily seen, of course, at the collective level. But let's imagine for a moment we are all very, very, very rich. That there are perhaps 50 of us in a room, and between us we control a very significant fraction of the world's assets. This is, alas, not too far removed from the actual state of things, but let's suppose that 50 of us in this room basically control the world's economy. Would we as a group have a strong business case to address problems like climate change and inequality? I think we would. Indeed, the Hiro Mizuno, who until recently was the chief investment officer of the Japanese pension fund, GPIF, the largest pension fund in the world, with more than 1.7 trillion US dollars under management, and more than 1% of the world's equities and a similar share of many of the world's financial assets, he came to believe that his fiduciary duty required him to address the problem of climate change and the problem of social inclusion, particularly as it is emerging in Japan. He came to believe that as a major asset holder, he essentially could not diversify away from these massive systemic risks. That of millions of people are migrating north as the harvests fail. If accelerating inequality continues to put enormous pressure on our institutions of governance, it's a major threat to the world's economy. And in fact, much more of a threat, or if you like it this way, the downside is much greater than any possible upside from simply trying to generate alpha, particularly since in these very large investments, many of the asset owners hold a majority of their assets in index funds or passive investments. So let's assume for a moment that there is a collective case. And I've given you the example through finance, but of course we could imagine the 1,000 CEOs of the world's largest companies come together. They have an interest to address climate change? I think they would. Would they have an interest to address inequality? I believe so. So now what we're facing is a collective action problem. Business systemic problems, rates of economic growth are higher and more stable in societies dominated by inclusive institutions. So business should be leaping in and solving the problems that we face. So my book is essentially a hypothesis rooted in ongoing actions as to how this collective action problem could be solved. I suggest there are broadly 4 steps. The first is the reorientation of a significant fraction of the world's largest firms towards purpose as the goal for the firm rather than shareholder value maximization. I argue that shareholder value maximization was always a means to an end, that under a certain set of assumptions, maximizing shareholder value does perhaps maximize prosperity and individual freedom and even perhaps social welfare. But that in today's world, many of those assumptions do not hold. The most obvious being the fact that we're not pricing the massive expansion, but also the fact that in many parts of the world, many people cannot participate in the free market economy and are effectively excluded. So maximize shareholder value might work great when you have a democratically elected, transparent, capable, responsive government setting the rules of the game in such a way that competition drives prosperity and social welfare. But when those rules are not in place, this is no longer appropriate. The most obvious contradiction in Milton Friedman's thought, to my mind, of course, is that in many circumstances, well, a lot of the most effective ways to maximize shareholder value is to fix the rules of the game in your own favor. If we think about the fossil fuel companies, for example, they were almost certainly maximizing shareholder value when they invested hundreds of millions of dollars in climate denialism and flooded many of the world's political systems with money to avoid the imposition of carbon regulation. But I at least believe that is clearly not compatible with the maximization of global social. So if it's not about maximizing shareholder value, what should firms be focused on? I suggest that they should think of themselves as organizations whose purpose is to solve public problems profitably, to borrow a definition from Colin Mayer at Oxford, which I like very much. And that in particular, they have both an active duty and an economic interest in making sure that the institutions of capitalism are in balance. And we can talk exactly more about what I mean and what a purpose-driven company is. But for my purposes here, the exciting thing about purpose-driven companies is that as they begin to solve social problems and environmental problems, they have the potential to trigger significant shifts in how firms operate and how industries are organized. So if you think of most obviously an entrepreneur like Elon Musk, a very complicated man, but he almost certainly accelerated the introduction of electric vehicles by 5 years. Or think of the enormous outpouring of entrepreneurial activity in solar and wind or in plant-based foods. These are places where entrepreneurs have been determined to develop new innovative solutions to the problems that we face, and in many ways have greatly accelerated industry transition. The other way in which purpose-driven firms may play an important role in addressing these questions is in demonstrating and living what I call high-performance work systems, an old idea, but the idea that if you treat employees with dignity and respect, give them a living wage and decent benefits, give them the freedom they need to get their work done and a sense of meaning and purpose on the job, that these kinds of firms are significantly more productive and innovative, as well as creating significantly better jobs. Now, I'm not arguing, and don't argue in the book, these kinds of firms are unilaterally profitable. I argue that they can certainly survive and thrive in a competitive environment. But small is a demonstration project at scale of how we could imagine creating a just economy with decent jobs for everyone. And that's very important. And of course, changes the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who work for these kinds of firms. So if we imagine that first step as purpose-driven companies beginning to solve these major social problems, that in themselves helps, I think, move the world forward, but it also does something else very important, which it creates a cadre of firms who have an economic interest in behaving well. Often they have told their employees they're purpose-driven, they have signaled to their consumers that they are more sustainable. They're very keen to sustain this mode of operation, but of course challenged by the fact that many of the problems we face cannot be solved by any firm working alone. And what these firms have increasingly begun to do is to collaborate with each other. To, for example, in the case of the food industry, to address problems of deforestation by forming collaborative agreements which say, I will buy sustainably produced beef, soy, palm oil if you do. And that way, neither of us will be at a competitive disadvantage. And together, we will address the long-term health of all of us. You're seeing collaborative arrangements like this develop in industries as different as textiles, mining, and food, to some degree in IT, where firms are banding together to try and collaborate to address these very difficult kinds of problems. This kind of collaboration, of course, has its own limits. It's often unstable. There are often a group of firms who say, well, yeah, maybe it's in our long-term interest, maybe it's not. I face short-term pressures, I'm not going to play ball. And so the third step in this progression is when these firms who are trying to collaborate say, whoa, I need help. I need an institution that will enforce this collaborative movement in support of the collective good of the whole private sector, or the whole industry, or the whole region. And in the book, I suggest that there are two ways that this collective action problem could be solved. One is through finance. I talk a lot about what I call rewiring finance, the importance of remaking accounting. I talk about the fact that I think accountants might save the world, that metrics could make it much easier to solve these collective action problems, and that investors, in fact, might act as enforcers. And I also talk about the way in which finance as a high-end finance might itself be able to enforce the collective action problem because it's so much in its long-term interest. I think that, in fact, the incredible concentration of wealth we face at the moment might have the upside of possibly helping us to solve global warming. I think it's much less likely, in fact, that this mechanism will enable us to deal with the problem of inequality, but we could talk about that. And then, since I don't think rewiring finance is going to get us as far as we need to go, I open the question of whether business could help rebuild our institutions. Business working in partnership with civil society and government could begin to rebalance our society. And, you know, people often look at me like, seriously? You know, when we get to this part of the conversation, because of course, firms that have very strong influence in politics face a horrible prisoner's dilemma. They don't want to give up the ability to influence their local regulators or to shape the political environment, particularly not if their competitors retain that ability. But I do think the term prisoner's dilemma is because, for example, in the United States, more than 70% of the population believes that the society is run for the benefit of the rich and the wealthy, and this is before the pandemic. And that is not stable. That's one of the reasons we're having the kind of political difficulties that we are. And so I strongly suggest to business leaders that they have a strong interest in what I call civics, not politics. That is, in ensuring that the democracy is real, that it is not flooded with money, that everyone has a chance to vote, and that in effect, they help support a strong public sector to balance the power of the private sector. I suggest that this has happened historically, not often, but that there have been important moments in the history of several nations where the private sector has stepped up and worked with representatives of civil society and government to rebuild their institutions in a way that creates what leads to well-being. When I go into detail as to what those examples are, many people say to me, but Rebecca, that only happened when institutions and society were on the verge of breakdown. And that does indeed seem to be the case, that it takes a great deal of pressure to move business in this direction. But I fear, and I hope I'm wrong, that we are approaching such moments of extreme pressure. And so working now to build coalitions among leading edge businesses that might be willing to step up and take the lead if and when it seems appropriate feels to me like something very important to do. Last but not least, there's a suggestion that runs right throughout my book that what's really important is to change the normative regime. That no business person nowadays, I hope, would say in public, well, of course I use child labor. I mean, who wouldn't? They're cheap and, you know, great manual dexterity. But there are some things we have decided it is not appropriate for business to do. And I think we need to expand that pool, that in focusing so much on profitability and on me right now as the only goal of business, we have neglected us and later and enabled a range of behaviors that have been extraordinarily destructive. Reimagining capitalism, and I think we can. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. That certainly has given us quite some pause for thought. So, amongst our panellists, who would like to kick off? Kurt, you're in.
Yeah, look, I would like to respond, mainly because I think there's a couple of really strong examples in New Zealand that already exist and have been up and running for a number of years that are a great expression of what we've just heard from Rebecca. So two components. One is the Climate Leaders Coalition, which is 105 of New Zealand's largest businesses, which have signed up to 2 pledges in relation to their emissions and to reducing their emissions to enable New Zealand to meet its climate obligations. Now, just for Rebecca, just for your benefit, those 105 companies represent about 60%. That's 60% of New Zealand's emissions. So that's quite a powerful cohort of emitters who have committed to reducing their emissions, and will come at some cost to them as they transition their businesses. But they're obviously taking a much longer view about how that will happen. The second example I would point to is, and it's an important component of how you transition in terms of your management of climate. The Aotearoa Circle is a group of public and private sector organisations in New Zealand who have committed to doing a lot of work. Particularly the first report they put out was on sustainable finance. And so there's kind of 3 components to what they see as the enablement of businesses to manage across a range of spectrums, not just in climate but in biodiversity and so on and so forth. Firstly, leadership. Secondly, data, and that really enables better pricing for risk. And then pricing natural and social capital as part of what they do as well. So I think, without wanting to continue too long and disallow my colleagues here from speaking, I think those are 2 really practical examples of things that are happening in New Zealand, which directly reflect some of your thinking, which I think is fantastic.
I might,
Ruth, can I respond?
yes, please, Rebecca, do.
Kurt, thank you very much for those examples. I knew that New Zealand was at the leading edge of climate regulation. I think the recent legislation is super, super exciting, but I had not known about the Climate Leaders Coalition or the Aotearoa Circle. As you will see if you get the chance to pick up my book, it's not just some academic story I've spun in my office, that in fact you can already see elements of this unfolding. And it's so exciting to see it happen in New Zealand. But, you know, I talk about things like Climate Action 100, which is 40, I got to get this number right, 460 investors, 40 trillion of assets under management, committed to pushing the firms in the portfolio towards emissions. Some of the collective action, like We Mean Business across the US, working with governors and mayors to reduce carbon emissions state by state, city by city. Some of the really exciting work going on in finance and impact investing. So yeah, I really think this is happening, and it's fantastic to hear that it's well underway in New Zealand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that response, Rebecca. I really appreciate that. I've just got a question that might dovetail nicely into that. It's a question submitted by Amanda Egg, in fact. And she says, isn't waiting on business to do the right thing an inefficient way to do things? I don't see why you would encourage change to happen privately instead of by government regulation.
Can I respond to that? Because I think it's a really important question. Actually,
absolutely.
The Climate Leaders Coalition was developed in advance of government regulation because those 105 business leaders felt the government was moving too slowly. This was the previous government. And that indeed, one of the biggest challenges we might face is the pace at which public policy can respond or not to some of the big shifts that are going to be required. So I don't think at all that we should wait for government to do things, particularly when you've got strong leadership within business who are willing to make commitments that cost real money.
Thanks for that, Kurt. Jo, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would like to add to that. Because climate change inequality is a long-standing issue and complex issue, it will require multiple actors to solve the problem. I don't think it's something that the government can do alone. It has to be bring along with the business, the individuals, and it's not just about one or the other. It's actually working together, like the book that Rebecca mentioned in the discussion.
Good. And Phil, yes.
Well, I might add to that as well. And you mentioned, obviously, whether it's sort of business or government. I mean, one of the, I'm interested in your thoughts, Rebecca, in terms of this nature of almost the separation that we have between the way that business operates and the way government operates. And I think, for example, of some historical examples, and I'm thinking here, for example, of Mondragon in Spain, one of the top 10 companies in Spain, which is a workers' cooperative. Now, it is interesting that Mondragon effectively started around the 40s and 50s as a result, obviously, when Spain itself was coming out of a period of fascism. Now, one of the challenges, of course, of business becoming very invested in government is that you end up potentially, like you are in the States at the moment, with a real challenge of what is civil society. So is the extent here not so much actually trying to bring business into government, but actually bringing democracy into business in a sense?
Oh, what a great question. I think business should be supporting democracy in democracy. If you're sitting in the US, as I am, that seems a very real question. And having the private sector stand up and say, no, we value democracy, and it's a crucial element of who we are. Forgive me.
That's great.
Sorry about that. Basic rule 1, turn off the telephone, forgot. But should we bring democracy into firms? So I think Mondragon is an extraordinarily interesting company. I had the great pleasure of writing a case on it. And I know quite well a number of people who've been involved. And of course, there's been a lot of study. What is striking about Mondragon, Bill, and I'm sure you know this, is how little imitation of the form there's been. That is, as we look across the world of cooperatives, the vast majority are consumer-owned or supplier-owned. That employee co-ops seem to require a particular mix of growth and people and commitment. Now, I'm a huge fan. If you have a good sense of how we can waive or generate more employment, I am completely there. And one of the policy recommendations I always suggest is any barriers in the way of formation of employee co-ops should be pulled down. And the more sort of help we can give, say, family-owned firms, sell to their employees rather than to others at the right price, these all seem like great ideas. But at the moment, it's not clear to me we know how to implement this solution at scale in sufficient time to address the massive issues we face.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. I've got a couple of questions here that slightly vary from the topic, but both around carbon. We've got one here from Ralph Chapman saying pricing carbon realistically would mean something like $500 per tonne of CO2 if it is well underway in New Zealand. Why are not emissions falling significantly? And then just to segue into another question supplied by John Porter, he wanted to know, Rebecca, what does carbonomics look like as an alternative global model to economics?
So I will leave to Kurt the question of why emissions aren't falling in New Zealand despite sort of protestations that people are doing things. I'm sure there's a good reason these things are complicated to move. On the question of how high a price you need to put in place, nobody knows exactly. I've seen figures ranging from $150 to $200 a ton, even significantly higher. What's important, I think, is to begin the process of pricing. I was a professor at MIT for more than 20 years. I'm a great believer in that if we can give the market a strong demand signal, if it's clear that using fossil fuels is going to be expensive and going to get increasingly expensive, we would move much faster than most of our models suggest. So I would be a big fan of putting in a lower price and gradually ratcheting it up over time. And of course, making sure that is not a regressive move. So returning funds to those at the bottom of the distribution in a sensible way. But I think that would really accelerate the transition in an important way. Will it be disruptive? Will it be short-term expensive? In some ways it will be, but the long-term costs of doing nothing are, I believe, significantly greater. And so this is an area we must move on. On the question of carbonomics, I had the great good fortune to see a really interesting paper suggesting that we should reorient our economy around the idea that burning carbon is like really expensive. I couldn't agree more. I'm not a specialist in the precise details of how we formulate carbon policy, but the core idea that we should make it very clear to everyone and enact in law in that burning or using up releasing carbon is very, very expensive to everyone is indeed where we need to end up. For me, the big question is how. And one of the reasons focusing on cooperation and finance is because I think it's a part of the solution to building the political will to putting this kind of regulation in place globally, which is ultimately we need some form of global regulation.
Thank you. Joanne, you had something you wanted to add to that, I think.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that the issue of climate change has been around for a long time. Like, for example, 15 years ago, there was a paper by Professor Dennis Meadows and his dear scientists, the title The Limits to Growth. And in that, they built a computer model, look at what the emission might look like, a population and the natural resource and those sort of things might look like in the next 100 years. And then we put clearly so that under circumstances, if we keep on doing what we were doing at that time, 50 years ago, at some point, not too far from now, actually, we run out of resources and a lot of production collapse and standard of living collapse. And we ignore that kind of advice from 50 years ago. And now, at the moment, there's still a lot of denial about the climate change. So having carbon price normally is a good measure for changing behavior, but there are still a lot of people quite skeptical about the real issue underlying that. And of course, they also trade off between the economy and also choices. Like if you talk about from the transport perspective, for example, if you increase carbon price, how do we get people around? Do we have the supply of vehicle that clean and affordable to people? So there are a whole bunch of underlying issues that we need to address. It's not just about using one mechanism. And that's why I mentioned earlier that we need to look at multiple sectors and also working together. It's not just about the government. A lot of things as an individual can do, as what Rebecca mentioned in the book, that even tiny change of habits individually can make a difference. And we can influence our neighbor, influence other company, if a firm, and so on and so forth. And I think relying on just on carbon price is not really the right way going forward.
Sure. And Phil, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that Joanne raised the question of the Meadows work. I mean, effectively what they said, and certainly Donnell did quite a lot of work on that, is around the differential assistance theory. And right at the top level, you've got effectively the paradigm which is around, obviously, the view around carbon prices. But one of the challenges we have is we're not really tackling our respective worldviews, are we? Which is one of the critical challenges in terms of shifting this forward. And the one that I guess from an economics perspective, which would probably be of most importance, is that freedom of action. I am a free agent. And I think it's Kevin Anderson, that the professor of climate science at Tyndall Institute, suggested that if the top 10% of emitters in the world reduced their individual carbon profiles to the average of the European average, not the African average, but the European average, we would drop emissions by something like 30%. Well, that would suggest that there's a certain level of compulsion would be required to achieve that. And so we're right up against, therefore, our perspective around what is an economic free agent and should I have the right to economically emit in effect. I don't know if that was I don't know, I've got a response to that, Rebecca, in terms of how we tackle that question, but are we just sort of dancing around the sort of the parameters here rather than some of the deep questions?
No, Phil, I mean, I love your comment. The way I sometimes phrase it is I say we persuaded ourselves that if we focused only on me and now, that somehow everything would work out right. And that someone else who would take care of us and later. But certainly as people, all we had to do was, do our thing. and that was our right and our duty, and it all lined up. I think it's clearly nonsense. You know, even the great faith traditions, the idea that at the individual level, focusing only on yourself and right now is a skillful way to live your life. I think all the great faith traditions would say, well, that doesn't make any sense at the individual level. And I think if you're a historian or sociologist or a mother, they would say, no, we're deeply enmeshed in community. And this is what I meant when I said the maximized shareholder value maximized welfare under a very specific set of assumptions, which was essentially someone else was taking care of the public goods. But if there is no compulsion, for example,
Oopsie. Oh, we just have Rebecca. Shall I carry on? Yes, we're just having a few technical problems there, Rebecca, with your bandwidth, but I'm sure it'll come right. I just sort of on that same theme in a sense, I have a question here from Susie Keith, who is asking about our wellbeing indicators, Treasury's Living Standards Framework. And she's asking, how can embedding wellbeing indicators in public policy design help to drive the change that Rebecca wants to see in our economies? I'm not sure if you caught that, Rebecca, or if anybody else has any comment on that particular question.
Well, I mean, in that Aotearoa circle work, they certainly talk about better pricing mechanisms for social and natural capital. So as a way of recognising some of those things, so that would be kind of one possible piece of thinking about it.
From the transport space, we actually take the living standard framework and the wellbeing framework and incorporate in our transport outcome framework. So we incorporate the key element out of that, and we use that to guide our policy decisions. So the short answer is yes, they are informative to help us to know what will be our priority in terms of looking at the longer term needs of the individuals in terms of their transport needs and looking after the people to help loosen fires.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you. Phil, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my only thought there was, I mean, one of the challenges that we have here is that things such as social value are essentially very qualitative. And it's only by exposing sort of some of our basic assumptions that we can really kind of get around the question. I'm thinking particularly here around the concept of an essential worker, which is interestingly, the values in a market are supposed to reflect the return that we get from a particular role, for example. And clearly, really interesting in the last COVID pandemic, we've had a situation where essential workers fundamentally have probably not been paid at anything like the rates that you would anticipate with the non-essential work would be. So the concept of value there is really quite interesting, and how you actually embed value within a structure. And it requires us to have probably a deeper conversation as to what we really want to achieve in the longer term.
So the Treasury, I understand, have been developing some of the values in terms of measuring some of the non-market impact, if you like. Although a lot of things still really new, and we haven't really got kind of everything sorted. But in terms of getting those information into decision, there are ways that you can actually summarize the information for the decision maker about these sort of impacts that you potentially achieve. There are also studies that are being done to look at some of the understanding in the transport space anyway, some of the impact to society on, for example, on reliabilities and safety and so on and so forth. So there are something available, but not everything.
Right.
But yeah, so.
I think one of the challenges is consistency across the public sector in terms of interpretation of some of those issues. Because if you have inconsistency, then I don't think that's going to lead to particularly good public policy.
Fantastic, thank you all very much. I have another question here that may change this a bit. It's again from Ralph Chapman. He's saying, this is some time ago, Phil puts it well, the more permissive economies such as the US, Australia and Canada, even New Zealand, seem to be doing poorly in terms of carbon emissions per capita and actually reducing emissions. So from a climate point of view, do such permissive economies have the answers? It's a good question, I guess. Does anybody?
Well, I mean, I think my response to that would be, despite the fact we feel like we might be deep into this carbon journey, we're not. And perhaps some of the responses to reducing carbon emissions that are developed as a result of these large coalitions of the willing, whether it's public and private sector or the private sector or who it is, enable development of new technologies to reduce some of those emissions, particularly in reduced carbon. In the economy, I do think New Zealand has its own peculiar challenge in that 50% of our emissions are from our agricultural base, and that is a particular challenge to New Zealand, and it's one that we'll have to think about and grapple with. And so, what are the trade-offs there? Well, we can do genetic modification to reduce emissions if the legislation would allow us to do it. Currently, businesses and government science is conducted offshore. Should we be doing that in New Zealand is another kind of practical question for New Zealand.
Right. Yes, Phil.
Well, certainly I mean, I'm coming back and thinking through to Kevin Anderson's work again. I mean, clearly the scale of ambition is probably not reflective of the position. I'm talking globally here now as well, of where we need to be. I mean, I think from his comments, he was saying that we need a 10% reduction in carbon emissions every year by 2025, and we need to have eliminated carbon from the entire global economy by 2050, which is certainly from his perspective way off pace and nowhere near where Paris needs to be as well. So it comes back. We've started the talk obviously talking about reimagining capitalism. Imagination is something that clearly we're going to need a lot of here if we get outside the box, because incremental change is not really going to hack it.
Yeah.
I think one of the other components of that we haven't really discussed is, which is going to be as much of a problem as not addressing climate or carbon emissions quickly enough, is displacement of people, jobs, and geographies as a result of changes in behaviour that will happen, and how you manage that, from a societal perspective. I mean, we have a term in New Zealand that just transitions work, as we've, as the government engaged with the oil and gas ban and thinking about what happens to those communities as a result of that. I think it's going to be something that will become as prevalent as communities which are impacted by climate change, by sea level rise and so on.
I have, oh, sorry, Joanne, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a little bit on that. I think it's related to some of the comment that Rebecca mentioned earlier. She mentioned that a lot of things business can do doesn't mean that they might make a profit. They will survive. They might continue to exist and do the business. Might not be deriving profit as good as before. So I think the related argument with that is actually in terms of the consumer. Do we actually still consume the same thing as before? I think that's related to the use of total natural resource. And it's not just about climate, it's actually about the whole natural resource that we're facing, the issues that we're facing. So if we can actually we think how consumer consume, do we actually need to consume all these sort of materials like we used to? If we don't, then the whole world will be quite different. So the step change you're talking about could potentially be possible, because prosperity is not just about income or wealth, it's actually also about standard of living. So the way how consumer or individuals see things is actually also important in the whole picture.
Absolutely. And there's an interesting sort of big question, a big picture question that's been submitted again from Amanda Egg, who's obviously very engaged. She's said to get to the moon, the US had to reshape how their economy works, and that could only happen with a coordinated effort by the government. Do you not think we could make a bigger, faster change if we utilised all of our constraints better by doing away with the deficit myth? Now, I wonder who'd like to answer that one. Is that one for you, Kirk?
Quite happy.
Not really.
I'm quite happy to pick up that one.
You're happy for that one, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe we need a modern monetary theorist in here to discuss
Yes,
that.
well, maybe Phil can fill in that
Well,
space
the
for us
interesting,
today.
the interesting aspect, if you read the likes of Stephanie Kelton, what she's actually saying is that this is just looking at the economy through a different lens. This is not actually about implementing modern monetary theory. It's about basically reflecting what is currently occurring as we speak. There are some really interesting, I wouldn't class myself as an MMT expert by any stretch of the imagination, but essentially what it is saying is that, yes, it is a myth that the government can run out of money, and the key constraint on government is not the size of the deficit, but the rate of inflation. And the critical question from an MMT perspective is the metrics by which you manage the economy, which become fundamentally different. In an emissions context, it's quite interesting because at the moment we have eye-watering amounts of personal debt, which at some level will have to be paid back. If, on the other hand, you take an MMT perspective, a government's borrowing does not need to be paid back over the longer term if inflation is kept in check. Now, that would suggest that if I have to grow the economy to actually effectively pay back my private debt, but I don't if it's public debt, then potentially emissions could be impacted by that kind of shift. So changing the way that we actually view the way the economy works could have a profound effect in terms of our ability to address the climate problem.
Thank you so much for that, Phil. Yeah, so it is really clear that we're going to have to get very innovative. And as Rebecca mentioned earlier, the pressure's on us really. And my question is really, do we have significant pressure on our systems, on our business, on our government at this point to actually start to embrace some of these alternative and innovative approaches to economy? How would you think we're doing in terms of that, Kirk, in terms of our preparedness or our willingness to actually put a completely different lens over, in your case, the business community?
Strangely, I would approach that from the perspective, not necessarily of business, because I think business has the capacity to change and shift and attract capital if it has, an attractive proposition in that respect. But more about the consequences of not having a plan. Having a plan for, say, for example, emissions reduction by 2050, but not having a plan about what those communities are going to look like that are most heavily impacted by some of those big shifts that are going to have to take place. So again, I think strangely for me, it's supposedly talking about business. I do, because actually in the end, there'll be some very human consequences, and it's interesting to hear the current different parts of the current government talk about the impact of the economic transformation that occurred in New Zealand in the 80s on people, and the deep memory of that, even across that coalition. What I think is we're going to have those sorts of impacts on people's lives if we're not very, very careful about how these transitions take place. So they're going to be as important as some of those big changes that we make. Otherwise, we will have the same problems in a different form.
Phil?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, again, going back to MMT and the likes of Kelton's work, one of the key planks there is the concept of the job guarantee. The idea that government fundamentally guarantee the roles in the community and effectively underscores the cost of that through deficit spending. Now, the interesting dimensions to that, of course, is that the way that it's suggested it works in conceptual terms is that the demand for those jobs is generated by the local communities as well. The local communities decide what they want doing, and that therefore there's an element of shifting people's working lives in effect and giving them the opportunity to keep on, to keep the skills going and the rest of it. So again, there's different ways we can look at this. And I think this question of whether we need to be a little bit more open to that. I mean, to a certain extent, you could go back to Margaret Thatcher and blame her, saying there is no alternative. There's got to be alternatives, and we have to explore all of them.
Thank you. Phil, Joanne.
I think one of the message I got from the proposal is that quite often we think that when we solve the climate problems, we might create one set of jobs and a lot of people miss out. But actually, there are the books indicate that there are, and also some other places that I read as well, there are job opportunities with new technology. And that's some of the things that we probably need to think about is that you're training up the labor to actually better match the job requirements. So that would refer to your point about whether it's just in terms of the shift. So I think that's why the different sectors need to work together. Even for the government department, you have different departments work together to solve the common problem. It's not just one sector's problem.
No, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you still, I agree with that what you want to do is move away from, the types of big skills mismatches that we have in New Zealand at the moment, because they're pretty inefficient and all that sort of thing. Not really great for people either. The other problem that I do think is a much more difficult one to get around is the geographical dislocation effect, which you've seen in a whole range of communities over New Zealand's economic history. It's very, very hard, even in the sort of, even with the framework that Phil outlined, it's very, very, it can be very challenging.
Yeah. And leads to real world consequences. I mean, if you go back to my country of my birth, and you look at the map of Middlesbrough right now, it is pretty much green fields, Teesside Polytechnic and the Sainsbury's. And yet its population is only about 10% less than it was at its height of the industrial boom, when it was covered by, it was essentially the workshop of the world. And it's the challenge to that is that if there isn't some form of intervention to create some kind of just transition, you end up with some really big political problems. And it's no surprise that Teesside, for example, was one of the ones that voted for Brexit, because fundamentally people felt left behind. So yes, we have to recognise that too, and look at how we transition some of these industries.
I mean, so right now, I mean, there are three large industrial firms in New Zealand that are essentially industries in their own right. In terms of Tiwai Point, New Zealand Refinery, and New Zealand Steel. Now, they don't just exist in their own right. They are also workshops for skills around. And more broadly, not just directly, but peripherally, for manufacturing skills and all of the types of skills that New Zealand's going to need to probably grow, even in a decarbonised situation. So you're talking about STEM skills. Now, if you don't have those, because we don't manage our policy settings correctly, and those firms are no longer competitive or no just to shut down whatever it is. That's a much broader problem. It's the problem effectively, and I think that's one of the things we have to always keep at least near the front of our minds thinking about this. Yeah,
and it's interesting that, I mean, for example, just picked up, and it's happening elsewhere in the world, but for example, the shift at Marsden, they're talking about potentially shifting the refinery, or they're certainly stop refining, just essentially importing, aren't they? And there's been some discussion as to whether the refinery itself could be turned into effectively a biofuels plant to actually take that infrastructure and move that. I mean, and it's interesting because clearly what we require here is some sort of long-term thinking, and government does have a role in that as well. I mean, I know Rebecca mentioned, Elon Musk, for example, bringing forward electric vehicles by 5 years. The reality is Elon Musk got $4.9 billion worth of subsidies from the US government. So I mean, clearly, whilst we kind of potentially look at, well, it's not good to pick winners, and inevitably we do at one level, and we have to think in that longer term. So is there an opportunity at Marsden Point? Should be explored? Because that's going to require a significant level of ongoing investment to achieve that.
Absolutely. Joanne?
I just wonder whether Rebecca on the line.
Are you there, Rebecca? We've got your...
Yes, I'm here. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I wish I could be there with you in New Zealand. It's fantastic.
Well, you are actually, Rebecca, in some sense, and we've got 5 minutes to wrap up this webinar. So, Joanne, did you have a specific question for Rebecca?
Yes, I do. I just wonder, we talk about the how to tackle climate change and also the growth and just transition kind of issues. And I think Rebecca mentions some case study in Germany that they in Germany, sorry, they have really good growth and higher income. And I just wonder whether you might want to give us some thoughts on that, Rebecca.
Ruth, I don't have the greatest connection. Could you rephrase that question for me?
Sure. So Joanne was asking about the German situation with high levels of growth and income as well. How are they managing that? And would you see that as a model that we could look to here in New Zealand?
Oh, Joanne, I completely agree with you. I think that the German society essentially is in a high growth, high education equilibrium. So as I'm sure you know, they invest very deeply into worker training and into maintaining high wages across the entire society where they can. And that's put them at the leading edge of manufacturing exports. I mean, Germany exports more in total, not even as a fraction of their economy than the American economy does. And what they've got is a high education, high wage equilibrium. It takes all elements of the society to put that in place. I mean, as I understand it, this is a society that's really been building these kinds of institutions for the last 50 years with tight interaction between the financial sector, the private sector, with strong industry-level unions and a strong and effective government. And it's that combination. People say this often, but I think it's true. Some of the Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark, are running very strong models that I think we can learn from. So yes, I completely agree.
Well, that is, yeah, that's obviously something we can look towards. We've got various people asking questions around that, whether actually the market and private enterprise has ever led transformative change, or indeed is it always the case that it comes from a coalition of both business and government? And I presume you'd say the latter, would you, Rebecca?
Oh, I'd never say anything like always. I think in general, we don't have a really good understanding of where fundamental institutional systemic change comes from. Some intersection between a cultural and social change, a general sense that things should be different, with the private sector playing a role, but clearly not the whole role. And I mean, you can look at history and say, change is driven by sort of punctuated events, by wars and revolutions, but we also have examples where incremental change has taken us to very new places. I mean, Europe post-World War II would be a very good example of that, but of course, it was rooted in a fundamental catastrophe at the beginning. So I don't know. I think it's one of the things it would be great to have better understanding of, and in many ways, this question of, we need radical change, absolutely, but how do we get it? So I think all of us should be pushing as hard as we can on the lever that we think is most likely to make a difference, with some awareness of what everybody else is doing. But I think it's very unlikely there's a magic bullet or a single pathway.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I think we're going to wrap it up there now. We're so glad that you could join us all the way through, Rebecca, and very grateful for your presentation and input this morning. So good evening to you there. I guess the question on my mind is whether the pressure is building sufficiently in our situation at the moment to evoke this kind of transition, this coalition and collaboration that is actually going to be required to bring us forward and navigate the future in a safe way. It is looking quite perilous out there, isn't it? But let's hope
it is indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I apologize for the horrible connection problems I've been having.
No problem. We've got you loud and clear, Rebecca, and very grateful. And thank you very much again to our panelists. We've really enjoyed having you in the seminar room today here at Motu. And just to you, our audience, if there are any themes that are coming front of mind that you'd like us to do another research roundtable on, we'd be very keen to hear your suggestions. Again, it's a great time to be having these crucial conversations. So thank you all again for attending, and look forward to seeing you next month with another interesting, exciting topic. Thank you so much.